So hello, welcome to the 87th edition of Airhacks TV, and this time is just a proof of concept from YouTube. So the entire story was we started with Ustream, which was bought by IBM, and then just they canceled the streaming features, and then I moved to Vimeo. And by the way, back then I wanted already to stream on YouTube. The problem was the YouTube streaming service was not available in Germany or from Germany. So now it is available. So it's just a proof of concept. I actually don't care. So I'm curious what you like better, YouTube or Vimeo. So okay, let's start with the content. And the first thing there are around the corner workshops about building applications on AWS cloud, and the agenda is packed because the problem I have with the workshop is the mission is actually simple. So what I would like to do is to just to pick an Java enterprise app with a database and show the options what you can do in the cloud with it. So and I would really go like cloud native, so not use some virtual machines and lift shifts rather than use cloud native technologies. So we will cover lots of possibilities, and I will deploy a lot. But it's not like we will code entire time. We will just refactor the application to run on the cloud. So there are already a lot of registration, so enough registration. But if you like, of course, register, and I will send. I have to send a mail. I have no time to do that. So Airhacks news mail. And announce actually the workshops once again. So I will expect some more registrations. So I think I will have to close the registration before the deadline. So this is the Java on AWS, and there are already related questions, Airhacks TV questions in the on the gist. Okay. Podcast, also something interesting happened or related. So there was a conversation with Rudi D, and I forgot how to pronounce it. The Buch, I forgot it, so I have to re-listen the podcast again. So I practiced a little bit, but what they did is, long story short, they migrated a Payara cluster to they refactored a Payara cluster to a Kubernetes operator, which is actually a really interesting use case, and we had chat about that. And also related, this week there is a free conference called Java for Kubernetes, J4K, and I will talk about also Payara. So if you go to a meetup, you can register. Just point to the registrations for free. So the future is now overview of next generation cloud Java runtimes. And what I plan to do is to explain a little bit Micronaut, Helidon, Quarkus, Payara, and something like Tommy, what happens behind the scenes, and what could be the future, or what is future, where everybody is going, right? So this is everyone is going. So this is actually the interesting part. And tomorrow I'm invited to a conference. It's called the TDC. I was told it's a huge conference, and it's in Brazil. And I will combine web components with microprofile, so the full stack with microprofile backend and web component frontend. If you like, register. Both are absolutely free. And this is the workshop. You can register via Airhacks Live or Java on AWS. Okay, so this was about this workshop, and the other workshop is in December, but there are already enough registrations. So it will, how it's called? It is guaranteed to run. Okay, now first question. So the first question is, let's see, from Ho. This is a hard name to pronounce. Avidia98. So I think you were born in the year 98, I think. So, right? So this is like a hint. So no privacy on the internet, right? So if I use microprofile metrics and I want to manually count something, for instance, how many 404 responses in some API call. So what he would like, or she or he would like to find out, if you have a multiple Quarkus microprofile applications running in parallel, and the problem, this is the fact that actually is the same. If you would use a micrometer, it would be the same. So every node, every process gathers the matrix in memory. So someone will have to integrate the metrics somehow. And yeah, who is it? This is Prometheus. So what you usually will do, every instance could, for instance, tag the metrics with additional information like IP address or whatever you have, and then you would aggregate everything on Prometheus, because Prometheus is time series database. And by the way, there's a managed Prometheus on AWS as well, so AMP. So you could use that. What's also possible is you could actually deploy the Prometheus behind the load balancer and gather the metrics that way. This would also work. So there are different possibilities to do that. And this is not Kubernetes related. You also always have the problem with a load balancer because it balances the load. So if the Prometheus is behind the load balancer, you will get the first instance, the next instance, and so forth. So and yeah, so you can have tagging. So just take a look at the Prometheus documentation. I think the term is not tagging, rather than relabeling or something like this. So you can just add additional metadata about the nodes. So and then the next question is how can I make the /metrics path with authentication in Quarkus? So good or bad news? Good news is there is no more metrics path, and bad news, there is no more metrics path rather than q/metrics. And we discussed this at the show. I hacked something and it didn't work because I upgraded before AirHacks Quarkus, and they introduced the Q namespace, which is also mentioned on my blog. Let's see, Q names. Hopefully, I will find that space Adam Bean, and they introduced the Q namespace because of Quarkus. Yeah, this is the blog post, and blog post. What I did, I created an issue, but it's also linked to a blog post somewhere. Here is the blog post, and we also had a conversation on the podcasts with Erin Schnabel about that from Red Hat or IBM back then. So how to solve that? What you will have to do is what you can do. For instance, you can apply a different security options on Q and the path Q and without Q. So you can hide everything which starts with Q and just expose API calls without the Q, for instance. This is the solution to your problem. Next, David Salomon. So this is actually, I think, born 87, I would say. This is my guess. And so from Germany, he asked me what they did. They have a monolith with 2 microservices in a database. And now it says, okay, there's transaction A and transaction B. And if the transaction A fails, David would like to roll back the transaction B and ask something about X8 transactions. And X8 transactions are 2-phase commit, which would actually apply if we would have 1 microservice and 2 databases. But we have 2 databases in 1 microservice, so we get 2 independent local transactions. So what this means is the following. So so if we just switch to drawing board, and we have one service A and the other service B, and this is the database. So actually, to have 2-phase commit, you would have here this service, let's call it 0, and this service would call both services in one transaction. So this would be 2-phase commit to PC. But this is not a 2-phase commit, are just 2 independent local transactions. So the first one and the second one. So bad news or good news, you don't have any problems with 2-phase commit. And bad news is that you have 2 independent transactions. And if the services don't communicate with each other, is even worse, because you cannot even know whether this transaction was successful or not. So what you will have to do is to introduce like counter compensative transactions. So if this fails, and this service has to be notified in subsequent transaction, I think it's called Zaga pattern, Zaga, and say, hey, it doesn't work in my case, or on case of timeout. So you need to specify that it didn't work this time. So this service will have to not roll back this current transaction, rather than initiate a new transaction which attempts to undo the changes here. And the counter transactions in the case of Amazon would be not like if the order is shipped, you cannot just say we will just suck the order back. What we can do is we can ask the client to send back the package, but not to make it undone. It's impossible. So X8 transaction won't help here. What would you advise? First, if you like to split the monolith, hopefully you have a reason. The reason shouldn't be I would like to have microservices, rather than you have a serious business problems, or you would like to have two teams and not just one. So this it has to be worth. But then, if you split the monolith to microservices, you split one transaction, one monolith local transaction into two, you will probably have to, or not probably, you will have to introduce compensative transactions or a Zaga pattern, which means you will have to add additional use cases. So that's the problem. Okay, so back to the questions. So my name is Il Nano, I think. So this is a crystal clear. So I know, and I have no idea where you when you were born. So, but I've recently discovered a YouTube channel and I really like it. So thank you for watching. And now question about package structure. So I think I will have to switch to my drawing board again. So boundary control entity term. So boundary control entity, and ask me. Let us just say I have a create operation that goes through controller. The controller, there is no controller in BCE, it's control. The control performs a call to another service to run some business logic and the DAO logic finally. And in my BCE, there will be no DAO, just control is the DAO. And finally calls the DAO repository to save data into the DB, while the control is to be created under the boundary and the DAO is in the entity package. Where would you put the business logic? So a little bit different. So it would look like that. So it the boundary is this would be this would be a component. Yeah, and there are 2 layers or 3 layers: boundary, control, entity. So what boundary is easy. It's an API or kind of facade. So this is the boundary. And because nothing is perfect, the boundary comprises 2 classes. So one is usually, where's my pencil here? One is the JAX-RS, and the other one is the pure facade. So why this? Because in real life, what happens is the JAX-RS class, it has to deal with HTTP response, headers, e-tags, and stuff like that. And my facade is just facade and would like to focus on implementation of the business logic and not dealing with HTTP. So think about that. The JAX-RS resource is a decorator of this facade. So this is like, looks like that. This, it exposes the facade via JAX-RS or WebSockets or SSE, for instance, right? Now, and let's say we have a database. So then, if you have just CRUD, we are basically done. There is no control. It is just entity. And the facade just injects the entity manager with a persistence context. Entity manager, we have create, read, update, delete, and we are done. Now, if this grows here and becomes more complex, in one point of time, the boundary is no more cohesive. What this means is, it is we could actually split it into, or it is responsible for too many tasks. And so you cannot name it properly anymore, because it is not just a CRUD or master data management. It also handles validation and implements some business logic. So in this particular case, this is actually the task for us developers, is we have to factor out the business logic into controls. And these controls are POJOs, and they implement business logic, but this business logic is rather procedural. And if you would like to have a real business logic which is type dependent, then you would implement the business logic directly in JPA entities. So what it means is, let's say we have a complex CRUD case, you would get a JAX-ORS facade, a facade, then a control, and which is a POJO, and then an entity. And in this particular architecture, there would be no external libraries, no interfaces, no factories, just pure dependency injection and POJOs with a very few annotations. So this would be stateless or transactional, and this would be at resource, and this would be not annotated at all, or on Quarkus you will have to use at dependent, and entity would come with JPA transactions. JPA annotations. Now, and because we draw already the first box, we can draw the next one, if it's possible here. So this is the next one, and here this boundary would communicate with that, control would communicate with that, and entity could communicate with that. What is not as good, that if you have direction, if the control should not invoke the boundary, and it's also not great that boundary calls another boundary. Cycles are absolutely possible, and you cannot avoid them. They are not nice, but this is how it is. Perfect. Thank you. Now, Jakarta project with Payara, and redeployment causes the error. And if you look at the error, there are two classes, and you cannot cast the same class to the other class, which is actually impossible. So what it means is, like, string, I cannot, string is not string, or integer is not integer, or number is not number, right? But it is in Java very possible, because a class is a class not only by its type, it also has to come with the same from the same class loader. And as you can see here very clearly, you have two web app class loader. So what it means in your case, the entity is loaded by two different class loaders, which usually could mean that your entity ships in two jars, or it ships in a war in a jar. So it I would argue it is deployed twice in the same module. Genau is exactly, so it's German. So now we have it. So just search for your class, and you will see it is properly loaded, or it is deployed twice. Now, in a cloud environment, do you still use Docker to develop, and after finishing the app, push it to Kubernetes cluster? I have to say no. So the last time what I did, I just, for instance, with Helidon or Quarkus, you can just launch it locally, like in the case of Quarkus :dev. So you can test whatever you like to, or whatever you have to do locally. And then you can just package and push it to the cloud where the CI/CD runs. And if problem happens, usually it happens, because of load balancers, security group certificates, and stuff like that. So it is not necessary to run everything locally on Docker. But if you would have, multiple microservices and you have to mock something out, then I will use just Docker. I just in recent projects, I didn't even use Docker locally. I just, pushed everything to, for instance, my private GitHub account, which there was a hook which initiated the CI/CD process, and the application was deployed in one point of time. Exactly. So, and Jenkins X, yeah, you could use Jenkins X if you really are in the clouds. I would use whatever available in the clouds, right? And on Google, I think it's called Google Builder. On AWS is the code deploy and code pipeline, which you will cover in the workshop. And on Azure, which we will cover in the next workshop. Maybe, I don't know whether I will manage to do it this or next year. I also plan to do the same with Azure. So all the clouds have native CI/CD pipelines, which are basically more or less, you can just, code shell commands and something happens behind the scenes. So I think answered. So the next one, and this is the great friend of the show, Hans Pickemat, DHPI. So it also attended AirHacks Live several times. So thank you for that. And he asked me about stateless EGB versus singleton EGB with bean managed concurrency. So bean managed concurrency means there is no locking. So it behaves like Gang of 4 singleton. So class with a static field with no synchronization. And EJB behaves differently. So if you call the server, every instance of EJB is associated with a thread. So you get multiple parallel threads running. So that's good. So the question is, do we really need EJBs? So the answer is not always. So with EJBs, so and he asked me then, what would be, what is the killer use case? And the killer use case was actually explained a bit in the microprofile workshop. So if we go to, I actually forgot to find that, and there is an apps with microprofile. Let's see. This is airhex.io, and this is the workshop. And if you go to the workshop, there is somewhere a link to the GitHub repository, which is absolutely free. And by the way, every episode is a commit, so it's just really easy to track. And what I did here, and it is, you have to go to the reactor. So names are cool because a leisure project, right? So, and what a reactor does, it uses GraalVM, and every request initiates a GraalVM engine, which loads a handlebar or mustache and gets JSON and generates on-the-fly HTML. So the problem is that the engine is not thread safe. So what I have to do is I have to somehow, and also expensive. So if you would just open the engine on every request, it will take too long. So it actually takes too long in this particular application, but you could optimize that by introducing EJBs. So if I say I would like to have 30 EJBs, so the JavaScript engine would be initialized 30 times once, and then I can just reuse it, which is great. So for heavy resources, EJBs are just great, and this is impossible to do that with bean managed concurrency and singleton beans, for instance. Also, what I see easier with EJBs is how much load is in the system, and what EJBs come with. This is what you mentioned with the pool, and this is actually a feature because what's backed into EJBs is the bulkhead pattern, which comes later in this show. If you have 5 EJBs in the pool, there will be never more than 5 concurrent threads. And you can achieve the same nowadays with microprofile and bulkhead pattern, but EJBs always had the opportunity or possibility just with configuration from day one. And the question, of course, is what happens if we get the 6th request, and this is 503 or this. But you have to answer the same question if you implement the bulkhead pattern with fallback. Okay, now next question from Hans Pikemat is the following: ears versus wars, and he asked, I don't like ears, and this is true. And the reason why I don't like ears is because an ear contains multiple wars usually, and the question is why? Because you cannot replace a war inside the ear, so it doesn't make any sense. So even if you will have multiple Maven modules, which is also questionable in this particular case, we could just ship one war in an ear. And the same is true for EJB jars. Why we should modularize the application when probably or very likely even all the modules inside an ear come with the same version. And this is what I did or still do in code reviews. For instance, I took a look at the version number in POM, and what I'm really curious to know whether all the modules ship with the same version. If they do, it is already already bad sign, because we have a lots of modules, but all the modules are packaged at once and shipped at once. In this particular case, why we need the modules, right? There could be different reasons, but I will ask what are the reasons. And and if you just have one war and one EJB jar, which I really did, I think in the year 2003 to 2005-06, when Java E5 and Java 6 came out. I just said, okay, this is actually stupid. I always have one big war, one EJB jar inside the ear. Why we need the ear? And the answer back then is we had to use ears because you couldn't put EJBs into a war. this changed in Java 5, where you can combine Egbs with servlets basically in a war. Okay. And they say, okay, if you have something reusable, how to do that? And what you can always do, you can load into a war a jar. So this works perfectly. And what you can also do is you can put a jar, install the jar on the application server and say, this is my base layer. It's something like, if you think about this, Jakarta E or microprofile is just a set of APIs. And they are there, implemented application server. But you can say, okay, but this is not enough. I would like to introduce my own libraries. And my own libraries ship with additional features. So I could install them on the application server. And this became my standard. So this could also work. And we also did it. And if you have Docker, you can even put, these libraries in the base Docker image. And the rest is not an option because it will be way too complex and and less productive. Okay. Now, Ilbert 2001. So I think he's born 2001. So now we reveal lots of privacy here. I was just testing around, and this could be true, 20 years old because a student seems so. I was just testing around fault tolerance bulkhead pattern, and this is exactly what we discussed with stateless Egbs. In my example, I created a simple REST method that blocks thread sleep, and after that sleep, I returned dummy string. So this is actually very good to play with. I use bulkhead 1, which means bulkhead 1 means only one thread. How to know that? If you micro profile, go to micro profile. You will find a nice bubbles, and the fault tolerance is here. And then we can go to the spec HTML and then search for bulkhead. And this is, you see, semaphore style bulkhead and thread pool style bulkhead. And the difference is the waiting task queue. So you have something in the queue, and this is the number of parallel threads. And this has to be asynchronous. So now what we already answered is that bulkhead has something to do with threads. And now, where are the questions? Here. So, and now it's something interesting, because if it opens the incognito instance of Chrome, so this is already suspicious, because what I suspect is you cannot just put bulkhead, on the Java class and call it from a browser. What I suspect, you have JSF or servlet in front of the bulkhead, and hit the bulkhead at the same time from both Chromes, incognito and non-incognito in one. Then I get the bulkhead exception immediately. You're asking me to get the exception, or you got the exception? But it seems like the application behaves differently whether you launch it in private mode or not. And what it basically means is that the application is stateful. So what I suspect is you have a GSF or something with session, HTTP session, and in the private mode, the cookie is not sent back and forth. So it behaves differently. This is the explanation. And the actual question is, does it have something with the TCP connection? Not at all. This is absolutely unrelated to the TCP connection. It is only related to threads and parallel processing. And actually, most of you don't even need HTTP connection to have a bulkhead. So you can have a bulkhead, in the application and call it without a servlet, for instance. So if you have Kafka, it also has to work with bulkhead. It would make not a much. Yeah, it could make sense actually. It could make you could have a bulkhead which, if it overloads a microservice, the fallback would be to redirect this to somewhere else. So, for instance, yeah. So we covered. So your task is to go to microprofile.io, fault tolerance, go to the spec, and search for bulkhead. This is well explained what happens behind the scenes. And by the way, this is also where is here. If you go to commits and search for bulkhead, I actually tested this during the workshop. So if you search overload protection with bulkhead and the retries, so there is one, there are 1 to 5 episodes about that. So just clone the repositories, is free, and you have an hopefully running example. Okay, so we can close that. This is done. This is done, and now here, back to here. So I'm still a student. Yeah, I know it because 2001. And no, it's great questions and great observation, actually. This is how it should happen. And someone asked me about the unit test before. I think I skipped the question, right? So unit? No, it comes later. It comes now. So the next is about unit tests. So with unit tests, you will never find it out, because unit tests we just test, the it's complete different purpose. So yeah, great questions for our students. So yeah, I hope you got it now. So I'm really curious. Then I will ignore chat for today because we have 25 questions, which is a lot. So I will answer all the questions at once, and yeah, next time maybe we'll be a little bit more quiet. So Stefan Creator. So Stefan is probably the first name, and Creator is the last name, which is a nice name, nice last name. What is the difference between Java Util Logger, Java Lang Logger? So Java Util Logger is the older one. It was introduced, I think, in JDK 1.4. Java Lang Logger is like a logger for internal purposes, which also works great. And loggers from logging libraries SL4j and Log4j, which I try to avoid if possible. And what's the difference? The Log4j newest version is very fast because they used crazy patterns behind the scenes, but it doesn't matter because in most cases nowadays, Java Util Docker, Java Util Logger is just good enough because we are actually logging to system out println anyway. I mean, the entire purpose of logging and all the levels is basically gone. We're logging everything to a system out println, and someone gathers the CloudWatch or how it's called, FileBeat from Elastic. They just gather, the system out printlns and send it to a central location. Why so many different loggers? Today, what is fashionable to talk about? Maybe different programming languages a bit again. So and back then, if it started with Java, the hot topic were IDEs, which IDEs to choose, and then JDK 1.4 was around 2003, I think. You could, if you went somewhere and say, okay, and just mentioned a logging framework, so you can spend, the entire day discussing which logging framework is the best, which doesn't absolutely matter. And by the way, what I do is my very simple rule, so you can save a lot of time with that, is take whatever Java SE provides first and go with it and test it, of course. If it is good enough, perfect, because you don't have to care about external dependencies. And then if, of course, Java SE is not enough if you would run on a server, so you will need a server. So in my case, I prefer microprofile in Jakarta E because I can use multiple runtimes. And I learned it, 20 years ago, and it still applies. And it's the same true. So I just use what's there. I try to avoid external dependencies. So now, what do you think of unit tests? And what I think about unit tests is this also in the podcast EHEXFM. If you search for unit test, this is unit testing considered harmful. And I had a conversation with Alexei Golub, who actually comes from a .NET environment, and we had a great conversation, I hope, about unit testing. And he's absolute, he was at least, had very similar opinion to my. And why? Because in my opinion, the problems are not necessary in the business logic rather than in the infrastructure. So all the questions you ask me, you could never answer this with unit test. So how bulkhead functions, what it can do, we can start an integration and system tests or stress tests and try it out. So it's exactly what were two browsers, one incognito and the other not incognito. For me, it is a stress test. So Exactly. So therefore, for me, the most important test is actually stress test. Does it function? And of course, you cannot just start, with a stress test. So what we do is we start with a system test. And the system test or black box test the application from the outside. And of course, if you have lots of business logic, it is absolutely natural to write a unit test. The problem is why unit tests are so popular is the following. They are popular because the code coverage is measured and you get some nice numbers, some statistics, which is really appreciated by management. So more or less developers are forced to write unit tests, which are mostly pointless because a unit test not even executes the application in parallel. So I would say the unit tests are overemphasized. So you should focus on system tests first. And then as a developer, you will notice, okay, I cannot just reach this piece of code, or now it becomes too complex. Then you can just introduce unit tests. Or for instance, if I work with strings, whatever substring or regular expressions, I always write a unit test because I'm a lot faster. So I use unit tests not as a useful tool, but not as dogmatic, process action. So therefore, I don't mention them so much because they are overemphasized anyway. And I was in project where everything was green and code coverage was 80-90%, and the application didn't run. So that's the problem. So very good. So next one is using MP-REST client and Quarkus, two services on B. When I make a call from A to B, and the response isn't okay to cause maybe service B throws. Okay, so what it means if you call two microservices and the status code is not 200, you get an exception. It's not entirely true. The response code has to be higher than 400. Then you get the client error, I think. This is how it's specified. So where to find this specification? You will find this specification in JAX-RS. So if you search for the Jakarta RS or JAX-RS, JAX-RS, you will find this clearly stated. And if you call the service, you get the response, and and you can. So and the problem here is this is not reached because this is not 200. So it can be 200 to 204. It can be even 301. It can be, but it cannot be higher than 400. That's a problem. Now, how to solve this? So, and he asked me now, which option do we have? So you mentioned, I think this was microprofile client. Where is it? And by the way, thank you for the questions. It's crazy, 25 questions. So it was like, I thought it will slow down, but now I got even more questions than planned, which is great. So like a 2.5 show today. 2.5 shows today. And by the way, for instance, this is really hard to explain. So I'm thinking about implementing this, and I will probably record a screencast. It's easier for me. So just create a screencast and push it to my channel, and hopefully it will be more clear. If not, ping me next month. Okay. So I cannot reach line 2. Exactly. So, and how to deal with this? Microprofile IO, different spec. And this is why I really appreciate about microprofile and Jakarta. Everything is well defined. And if you learn this, it will run on all the runtimes. This is actually the great story. So, and we have the REST client. Here is it. And hopefully in HTML is here. And it was exception. So if you search for response exception mapper, and there is how to implement response exception mapper. So to throwable. So what you get the response, and you have to throw an exception. But if you return null, the exception is going to be swallowed. So nothing happens. So you can implement response exception mapper to handle your errors, and this is not a big deal. You can even install your default exception. There is somewhere should be a default response exception mapper, which can be declared in the JAX-RS in the microprofile config, which will apply to all. And as you can see, you can even disable it per client. Okay, I hope this is helpful because you have specific cases. This is how it was defined, that everything which is more than 400 is client error. How it's, I think, even HTTP status code, let's see, 401 unauthorized, but how is defined? I think it is defined as an error. Because what JAX-RS did, they just mapped the HTTP spec to JAX-RS. Yeah, client error. And because it's client error, you get the exception. Let's see whether we will find status code. Let's see, is 399. Never saw that in action. So, but you see redirects 300, 399, and now it comes client errors, and we get the client error, and then we get the internal server error, which is 500 and more. So you can have, you know, a range between 100 to 399. There's no exception, and with 400, it switches to client errors, and then you can implement your own response exception mapper to deal with that. Okay. Done. Friend of the show, Wanderer. Oh, and he's not born in 2097, so I don't believe that. Maybe in 97, and this is just, you know, additional salt, I would say. So now, he was playing with BCE, front-end edition. Okay, and the front-end edition is, I just closed my GitHub account. So this is the BCE design. This is the front-end edition. And I implemented a web components with the BCE idea behind boundary control entity. After the initial mindset change, it is actually becoming quite intuitive. Thank you. What I would be interested in, maybe we'll discuss the next bat. This is the big airhacks debate. We discuss on the workshop, what was your initial idea how to structure the applications? Because my idea was always, you know, try to find something from the business area or in the front end from views or something which you can see and name it. So this is my approach, and boundary control entity just fits perfectly. And now he asked me how you implement the JSON patch. So actually, the JSON patch is already implemented, and I for sure wrote a blog post about that, JSON patch. And there are multiple JSON objects with JSON patch. So this is done. The problem is, and actually what we did with JSON patch, also great with JSON patch or JSON, yeah. Yeah, and I had, let's see, and I mean, JSON patch, I remembered, JSON patch test. Yeah. And what we did in a project, there is a trick. What you can do, you have two JSON objects. You can use a JSON diff, which is part of the JSON patch. And if there is no diff, they're identical. If there is some diff, they are not identical. So what we did is we loaded a JSON object from the, we just recorded the conversation. Then we loaded one JSON object from the local disk and compare that with object which was sent over the wire. If they're identical, there was no diff. If there was some difference, there was a diff. So I actually wrote, this is fairly old. I think it has to be 5 years or something. No, 3 years. So you can just do this right now. It's implemented. You don't even have to download third-party libraries. It works out of the box. In the front end, a little bit more problematic because in the front end, there is no built-in support for JSON patch, to my knowledge. So I couldn't find that. And there are third-party libraries. So if you search for JSON patch JavaScript, there are fast JSON patch and JSON patch. But if you say JSON patch MDN, so you will find the patch, but this is like the patch from the HTTP perspective and not from the fetch perspective. So you will have to send, the JSON. You can just send the JSON object as a patch to the server and it will work, but there is no specific support for that in the fetch API. On fetch, I mean the MDN fetch. So this fetch. Yeah. Okay. let's see whether there's something in Twitter. So no questions. Oh, by the way, this is the conference. The TDC seems to be a large one in Brazil. And problem with such conferences, I was invited several times to Brazil, but Brazil is a little bit far away, and because of workload, it was not possible to come. But now is the unique opportunity, to participate in such conferences. But there are just too many of them. So I have this week 2 conferences, which is fun. But but this also takes some time to talk. Okay, now so this was about JSON patch, and then I use just patch, and in the recent project I used patch, and OData also supports patch, so just use patch. It is a good idea. So the next one is eTags. Yeah, you can absolutely do it with JPA entities. We even covered this already on the show. And version is not enough. You will have to combine version, of course, with the ID and the type. ID, version, and the type. So this, the type is probably known because you have the URI, and the ID and the version that are unique. Very good question. Should the REST resource be transactional? So this is the question, and we have here the nice drawing board again. And if you think about this, the question is: should the transactions be started here or here? And from my point of view, as early as possible, because if something goes wrong, goes here, the entire thing has to be rolled back. This is my thinking. If you would start the transaction here, what could happen is that, let's say, we are receiving the object, and we cannot convert the object to JSON. And then we get an error here, but the transaction is already committed. So this is the question: which behavior would you like to have? So I usually make this transactional. It's easier to understand, and it's easier and more consistent. But if you have reasons, just put the transaction here. Okay. Next one is and the idea is very, very simple. If you talk to the server, every invocation is a transaction. Done. That's the basic idea. And because you cannot just halfway talk to the server, and because of that, everything is local transaction. Done. So that is the thinking. So whatever we do with the application server is a use case, something, a function, and functions are transactional. So if you go to a database, and in the database you talk to the database, every insert is a transaction, right? So this is it is just every interaction is a transaction. Okay. So you are welcome. So you know why it is the agenda is opaque, because there are lots of possibilities. And what my personal goal is, so companies, some they go to clouds, and there was like a cloud native movement. And my opinion, what I would like to prove or challenge the attendees is, so for my opinion, boring applications like CRUD app which talks to a database, I think you can run it a lot cheaper on premise. But clouds have some killer features, like maybe higher security, because you can easily encrypt everything, or software as a service. So if you let's say consider now AWS, because you mentioned the workshop. So there's a cloud watch, like a built-in a log aggregator, CloudTrail, like security audit. You get everything for free, just a click. For free, not you have to pay it, but for free means it's just a click away. There's a text recognition service you can just pick, and these are the killer features where you can very quickly build applications, and you cannot just build it on premise. So would be the differentiator, not necessarily Kubernetes, because lots of my projects we don't use Kubernetes in the cloud because it's too expensive. So we use similar orchestrators, but not Kubernetes. But this would be the point of the workshop. And I had no time for prediction this year, but maybe I will still write it just for fun. But I think this year is also where the companies really will recognize how expensive actually clouds are. So if you see, the cost calculator from Microsoft, and if you see the cost calculator from AWS, so they try to help you with the costs, because otherwise they will just explode. So yeah. Now, long-running processes. Okay, we'll cover that. Batch job, and there's AWS batch, so we can cover that. And singleton in the cloud is fairly simple because it behaves like singleton outside of the cloud. So how singletons behave? Zookeeper. The purpose of Zookeeper is to have something like a singleton. What Zookeeper does is it locks a node, and with that, one leader is elected, leader election, and the leader is the singleton, right? And all the followers are waiting until the leader dies. And in the cloud, you could do something similar, not with Zookeeper. If you are in Kubernetes, it's already solved in the how it's called, the database, Kubernetes database, internal database. I wanted to say EHCache, which is completely wrong. Wait a second, I forgot it. The first time I forgot is an easy name. Kubernetes configuration database is called, no, not config maps. Config maps are stored in a database. Kubernetes ingredients. Yeah, this is a database written in Go, which is the successor of Zookeeper, and the entire configuration is stored in the database, in the internal Kubernetes database. And you could use, for instance, this database without the name to store the information, because the services are stateless, and singleton would mean this is the state what you are interested in, right? So what you will need a kind of synchronization, and you will have to use a store. And yeah. Okay. So, and how to implement that? Yeah, take a database and write to a table and decide who is the master. So this is the only thing what you can do. Or if you would like to have in memory grid, you could use Hazelcast for that. Also possible. Okay. Thank you. So now you know why the agenda is opaque. So now Skiptaros. So API gateway with Quarkus. And what happens here is the questions about retry. And it seems like there is a JBoss REST easy unhandled exception, and he or she or he, retry. And she or he doesn't would like to deal with that. And this is JavaNet Connect exception, interestingly, which was the issue and is wrapped with unhandled exception. Okay, how to deal with that? It's very similar. If you go to microprofile IO, and fault tolerance again, and search for retry, you will see that there is a fallback handler. And in the fallback handler, you can do whatever you like, because there is a fallback method and fallback handler. Where is the fallback handler? Yeah, and the fallback handler, exactly, has to be implemented. So you can implement, or you have to implement, your own fallback handler. And let's see, is here the string fallback handler somewhere? I don't see it. Yeah, it's not implemented. But string fallback handle, you get the execution context, and you can extract whatever you like, and then decide what you do with it. So this is the easiest possible thing you can do. Okay, now the next question is, what is Flyway? So what Flyway is, you write schema evolution, which means you just write the data DMLs, the data manipulations, or basically table changes in SQL, plain SQL, and Flyway will run them back and forth. And in a central table in a database, there's a table with the Flyway version, so you know in which state your database is. So what Flyway does, it calls scripts, SQL scripts, and you have to write the SQL logic there. So this is what happens behind the scenes. So 87, David Solomon again, backend developer, asked me, should we use Lombok project? So good question. If you ask me that way, I would say no. Why? Because it seems like you are not using Lombok and you are somehow happy, and now you would like, probably you are a little bit bored, or you say, okay, you would like to try Lombok. And in this particular case, just don't use Lombok, because Lombok generates code, and if you are happy with the without Lombok, you don't use Lombok. And of course, Java 16 already provides Java records. And one of the killer features of Lombok is generate getters and setters, which is no more necessary for Java 16. And I think Lombok already removed. If you search for Lombok Java records, Lombok Java record. Yeah, exactly. And I think if you search here for I found, I don't know whether in this blog post, in the newest Lombok, they removed the getter and setter possibility because no more required for Java 16, you have Java records. So, and of course, because Lombok generates code, in one point of time, if Java evolves, I mean, there's less and less to do. And for me, it's an optional tool, and this is very controversial, I would say. And whatever is controversial causes a lot of meetings and discussions, and then a little bit waste of time thinking about that. So I would say, what are the killer use cases for Lombok? And this, I would say, in one project, we had to generate hash code and equals, because lots of POJOs were cached. And this is great because, it happens behind the scenes. So this is one of the killer features. You know, the builders, getters and setters, and log injection, I don't think as a killer feature of Lombok. I would just, I'm not using that. So next one is, what are the differences between integration test, smoke test, system test, and unit test? Unit test is just a method. You're testing a method. Integration test, you're testing a class, and you are allowed to access file system. So this is a little bit more. It's like you would launch a POJO with surrounding POJOs. Smoke test is, I would call it torture test. So it would just, the torture test just calls your server and tries to break that. Or smoke test, in the puristic sense, is you just launch it and see what happens. Whether it, is there like smoke? It's like, you plug your TV set and see whether it is working or smoking. And system test is for me black box test. I'm interacting with the system through public APIs only, which is REST in 80% or 90% even of our cases. So can you please make your podcast louder? I hope they are loud, as maybe some episodes are. So I have the same setup, and I try not being too loud, because then ugly clipping happens, but I will try it. So thank you for listening. And this is from Davor Kritic, I think it's perfectly pronounced. So I will try it. And by the way, the next podcast, the next episode, just keep it secret, is with Kozuki or Kosuke Kawaguchi. And I will have to practice his last name Kawaguchi, about Jenkins, how Jenkins happened. So I hope I will publish it tomorrow. Now, Christian Frey asked me, many old applications use the command chain pattern. So this is like, command of, this is commands, parser, and stuff like that. So like a pipeline. How you would encounter refactor such problem nowadays? CDI async event? Maybe, or just call methods. So I mean, because there is no. The question is, if you have the chain of invocations, how often you replace the commands in the past? This is the central question. How many XML parsers do you have? Do you have to swap them? If yes, CDI event would be nice. Otherwise, I would just call the methods one by one. So like a template pattern almost. I call a method which invokes 5 methods in a row. It was the easiest possible solution. And yeah. So my name is Ilnano. Ask me, what would be the preferred way to handle exceptions in a Jakarta application? So the nice story is it doesn't matter anymore, because the most important question is how your exceptions are mapped to HTTP status code. So do whatever you like, but expose the exceptions in a reasonable way as HTTP status codes. So you see, bad request 400 is probably something with bin validation, right? So this is what I would do. So and the last question is about CDI events, and I wrote a post how it looks like in Java CDI event. So this is 12 years old. Let's see. It looks like this: add inject event hello event, which is typed, and then you just fire the event, and then on the other side you say I'm observing this event. So this is how it works in Jakarta E or microprofile, and they can be async. And what I also saw is this interesting. What it could do, what I did with this hack, when was it? 6 years ago. With that, you can get the event metadata, and from the event metadata, you get the injection point, and you know from where the event came, for instance. This is not what I confused that, because I saw injection point. With the injection point, I could, back then, I implemented like microprofile config with at injection point, and now the injection point is also available in CDI events. Okay. So, and the last question from David asked me, should we use DTO objects? No, because you ask me should. You only have to use DTO's objects if you have to merge multiple entities to one single thing. So, for instance, right? Or you need a subset of an entity. And nowadays, I would use Java records for that. And Java records becomes as a DTO on steroids. So it's very nice. It's just one-liner almost. So, thank you for watching. See you on upcoming conferences. Actually, tomorrow, if you like. And I try to post. I miss sometimes the conferences, but I try to post as many events as possible to the meetups. So if you like, subscribe so you get notified. And we have almost 500 air hackers here, which is incredible. And now we are almost done. So now optional story, because you asked me about unit tests. And what happened this year was I was invited to a testing conference. They asked for call for papers. And I submitted something like, unit tests considered harmful. So this was German conference. And they call me back, said, no way, we cannot do this. We are a testing conference, and there are lots of talks about unit testing, and you're writing, unit testing is irrelevant. But they were curious, and they actually had to call them and explain, and they asked for slides. I said, sorry, I have no slides. I will just code, because no one would believe that. So I was the first speaker in the entire conference, or the idea, to submit something without slides. And then there was like 2-hour talk, and it was actually great. So the feedback was good. There were some, agile coaches also participated in the workshop or talk. It was not recorded. And at the end of the day, they say, yeah, it's true. Unit test is just a particular tool, and it was too dogmatic. But yeah, it was a funny story, because there was like a rebel CFP. Okay, with that, if you like, see you on on Airhacks Live or hear you on Airhacks FM. Thank you and see you next month. And I will launch a poll on Twitter because I would like to find out whether we should stay on YouTube or go back to Vimeo, for instance. So thank you and bye.